Hello everyone, and welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Demilich. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. The Demilich takes up pages 48 and 49 of the Monster Manual, and before we dive into the lore, I'm going to start off with a little bit of flavor text first. I, Acererak the Eternal, beckon you to your doom. Come, foolish ones, plunder my treasures, if you dare. Others have tried, all have failed. From your skin, tapestries will be woven, and your bones will carpet my tomb. Only I am beyond death's reach. Only I know the secret to true immortality. The Epitaph of a Demilich. Now, on to the lore. The immortality granted to a lich lasts only as long as it feeds mortal souls into its phylactery. If it falters or fails in that task, its bones turn to dust until only its skull remains. This Demilich contains only a fragment of the lich's malevolent life force, just enough so that if it is disturbed, these remains rise into the air and assume a wraith-like form. The skull then emits a terrifying howl that can slay the weak-hearted and leave others trembling with fear. Left alone, it sinks back down and returns to the empty peace of its existence. Few liches seek to become demi-liches, for it means an end to the existence they hope to preserve by becoming undead. However, time can erode the lich's reason and memory, causing it to retreat into its ancient tomb and forget to feed on souls. The spells it once knew fade from its mind, and it no longer channels the arcane energy it wielded as a lich. However, even as a mere skull, it remains a deadly and vexing enemy. Enduring existence. Even after a lich is reduced to a demi-lich state, its phylactery survives. As long as its phylactery is intact, the demi-lich can't be permanently destroyed. Its skull reforms after 1d10 days, restoring the creature to its wretched state. If it has the presence of mind to do so, a demi-lich can reclaim its former power by feeding just one soul to its phylactery. Doing so restores the demi-lich to lich form, reconstituting its undead body. Undead nature. A demi-lich doesn't require air, food, drink, or sleep. So great is a demi-lich's will to survive that it will always have the maximum number of hit points for its hit dice, instead of average hit points. And that's all there is when it comes to the Demilich as a creature. However, due to the nature of Demiliches and how legendary they are, the Monster Manual also provides the reader with information on a Demilich's lair and how the lair behaves when encountered by a group of adventurers. A Demilich's lair. A Demilich hides its earthly remains and treasures in a labyrinthine tomb guarded by monsters and traps. At the heart of this labyrinth rests the Demilich's skull and the dust from its other bones. In its crypt, a Demilich has access to lair actions and additional uses for its legendary actions. Its whole lair also has unique traits. A Demilich in its lair has a challenge rating of 20. Lair actions. On initiative count 20, losing initiative ties, the Demilich rolls a d20. On a result of 11 or higher, the Demilich takes a lair action to cause one of the following effects. It can't use the same effect 2 rounds in a row. 1. The tomb trembles violently for a moment. Each creature on the floor of the tomb must succeed on a DC 19 dexterity saving throw or be knocked prone. 2. The Demilich targets one creature it can see within 60 feet of it. An anti-magic field fills the space of the target, moving with it until initiative count 20 on the next round. 3. The Demilich targets any number of creatures it can see within 30 feet of it. No target can regain hit points until initiative count 20 on the next round. Lair traits. A Demilich's tomb might have any or all of the following effects in place. 1. The first time a non-evil creature enters the tomb's area, the creature takes an average of 16 or 3d10 necrotic damage. 2. Monsters in the tomb have advantage on saving throws against being charmed or frightened and against features that turn undead. 3. The tomb is warded against the magical travel of creatures the Demilich hasn't authorized. Such creatures can't teleport into or out of the tomb's area or use planar travel to enter or leave it. Effects that allow teleportation or planar travel work within the tomb as long as they aren't used to leave or enter the tomb's area. If the Demilich is destroyed, these effects fade over the course of 10 days. Quite a bit there, quite a bit of lore there. And there's still a little bit more. There's a bit more alternative lore and information, if you would. So we'll go through that and see what it presents to us. Acererak and his disciples. The transformation into a Demilich isn't a bitter end for all liches that experience it. Made as a conscious choice, the path of the Demilich becomes the next step in a dark evolution. The Lich Acererak, a powerful wizard and demonologist and the infamous master of the Tomb of Horrors, anticipated his own transformation, preparing for it by setting enchanted gemstones into his skull's eye sockets and teeth. Each of these soul gems possessed the power to capture the souls on which his phylactery would feed. Acererak abandoned his physical body, accepting that it would molder and dissolve to dust while he traveled the planes as a disembodied consciousness. If the skull that was his last physical remains was ever disturbed, its gems would claim the souls of the insolent intruders to his tomb, magically transferring them to his phylactery. Liches who follow Acererak's path believe that by becoming free of their bodies, they can continue their quest for power beyond the mortal world. As their patron did, they secure their remains within well-guarded vaults, using soul gems to maintain their phylacteries and destroy the adventurers who disturb their lairs. Acererak, or another Demilich like him, has a challenge rating of 21 or 23 in its lair, and gains the following additional action option. Trap Soul. The Demilich targets one creature that it can see within 30 feet of it. The target must make a DC 19 Charisma saving throw. On a failed save, the target's soul is magically trapped inside one of the Demilich's gems. While the soul is trapped, the target's body and all the equipment it is carrying cease to exist. On a successful save, the target takes an average of 24 or 7d6 necrotic damage, and if this damage reduces the target to 0 hit points, its soul is trapped as if it failed the saving throw. A soul trapped in a gem for 24 hours is devoured and ceases to exist. If the Demilich drops to 0 hit points, it is destroyed and turns to powder, leaving behind its gems. Crushing a gem releases any soul trapped within, at which point the target's body reforms in an occupied space nearest to the gem and in the same state as when it was trapped. And that's all there is when it comes to the lore of a Demilich, so there's quite a bit there to chew on. But overwhelming as it may seem, that's a good thing because it gives us an opportunity to play around with and develop some scenarios or adventures for using the Demilich as sort of the main player, big bad evil guy type thing. But before we get into that, let's jump into the stats, shall we? The Demilich is a tiny undead creature with a neutral evil alignment. It has an armor class of 20, which is natural armor. It has hit points that average 80, or 20d4. It has a movement speed of 0 feet and a flying speed of 30 feet, in which it hovers. The Demilich has a strength of 1, a dexterity of 20, a constitution of 10, an intelligence of 20, a wisdom of 17, and a charisma of 20. Its saving throws include constitution plus 6, intelligence plus 11, wisdom plus 9, and charisma plus 11. The Demilich is resistant to the damage types of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from magic weapons, and it is immune from the damage types of necrotic, poison, psychic, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons. The Demilich is also immune to the charmed, deafened, exhausted, frightened, paralyzed, petrified, poisoned, proned, and stunned conditions. The Demilich has the sense of true sight for 120 feet, and a passive perception of 13. The Demilich speaks no languages and is a challenge rating of 18. On to the abilities. Avoidance. If the Demilich is subjected to an effect that allows it to make a saving throw to take only half damage, it instead takes no damage if it succeeds on the saving throw, and only half damage if it fails. Legendary Resistance. which can be used 3 times a day. If the Demilich fails the saving throw, it can choose to succeed instead. And finally, turn immunity. The Demilich is immune to effects that turn undead. On to the actions. Howl, which recharges on a 5 or 6. The Demilich emits a blood-curdling howl. Each creature within 30 feet of the Demilich that can hear the howl must succeed on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw or drop to 0 hit points. On a successful save, the creature is frightened until the end of its next turn. Life Drain. The Demilich targets up to 3 creatures that it can see within 10 feet of it. Each target must succeed on a DC 19 Constitution saving throw or take an average of 21 or 6d6 necrotic damage, and the Demilich regains hit points equal to the total damage dealt to all targets. And finally, the legendary actions. The Demilich can take 3 legendary actions, choosing from the options below. Only 1 legendary action option can be used at a time, and only at the end of another creature's turn. The Demilich regains spent legendary actions at the start of its turn. Flight. The Demilich flies up to half of its flying speed. Cloud of Dust. The Demilich magically swirls its dusty remains. Each creature within 10 feet of the Demilich, including around a corner, must succeed on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw or be blinded until the end of the Demilich's next turn. A creature that succeeds on the saving throw is immune to this effect until the end of the Demilich's next turn. Energy Drain, which costs 2 of the 3 legendary actions. Each creature within 30 feet of the Demilich must make a DC 15 Constitution saving throw. On a failed save, the creature's hit point maximum is magically reduced by an average of 10 or 3d6. If a creature's hit points maximum is reduced to 0 by this effect, the creature dies. A creature's hit point maximum can be restored with the Greater Restoration spell or similar magic. Vile Curse, which costs all 3 legendary actions. The Demilich targets 1 creature it can see within 30 feet of it. The target must succeed on a DC 15 Wisdom saving throw or be magically cursed. Until the curse ends, the target has disadvantage on attack rolls and saving throws. The target can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of its turns, ending the curse on a success. And that's all there is when it comes to the stats for the Demilich. So it's a pretty powerful creature, as you can tell, I'm sure. But it certainly is interesting, and the lore of it, as well as the abilities that it has, can lead to, I think, a very cool and interesting series of adventures or campaign or encounter type thing. So without further ado, let's jump into some adventure crafting, shall we? Okay, so immediately the first thing that comes to mind for me when I'm thinking of using a Demilich is, due to the fact that it's such a high challenge rating and such a powerful monster, it would certainly be a big baddie that I would use for my players at the table. Now, with that being said, you could create an entire campaign that was effectively something of a mega dungeon, where pretty much the Demilich is the final encounter, the final boss, the final battle before the end of the campaign. But you could start the campaign out with your players starting at level 1, being sort of wayward adventurers, kind of getting their feet wet, but they were given the task by whatever faction or guild or contractor or king or queen or whatever interested party to venture through this tomb and clear it out because it has befallen a curse over the millennia. You could have them enter the tomb to collect treasures. You can make it very Indiana Jones-esque, where they're just traversing through this tomb temple dungeon type thing, and it's gigantic, and they're there just sort of on the hunt for goodies. And as they progress through the dungeon, they realize that it's larger and larger and larger than they had ever expected it would be, or anyone else must have thought it was, because perhaps nobody's been inside of this tomb or these catacombs within the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years, let's say. And the chambers and pathways seem to go on forever and just lead further and further and deeper into other pathways and chambers. And I think in that way you could develop a pretty cool sort of thematic campaign even, where if you wanted to go the theme of sort of like cursed creatures, undead creatures, stuff like that. You know, you could use a lot of zombies and skeletons. You could use even vampires. You could use humans in the way of like cultists and stuff like that are worshiping within this temple. And perhaps you could design something that feeds into that, where, you know, perhaps the first level of the dungeon, or the first half of the first level of the dungeon, if you were to go the way of making this a gigantic mega dungeon, perhaps the first half of the first floor, let's say, is all just cultists of varying power and ability and stuff like that. And as the players make their way through this tomb or crypt, they encounter more and more treasure, but perhaps they also encounter on the bodies of the cultists some sort of key or some sort of item that opens up a hidden wall or moves a statue back to reveal sort of a staircase that descends lower, you know, and you can generate kind of one of those sort of haunted fun house type situations where there's the standard pathway and then there's these sort of hidden means of ingress and egress into more and more and more of this gigantic labyrinth until they finally make it to the bottom. And at the bottom, they encounter the Demilich in all of its power in its lair. And I think it could make for an awesome series of adventures or a campaign in and of itself, right? You could even go something to the effect of perhaps the tomb or the crypt changes form or changes shape every 24 hours, or its rooms change locations, and it sort of shifts itself to adjust and to try to trap the would-be adventurers within, right? And I mean, with the capability of the Demilich's lair to prevent escape, right, be it planar or dimensional type escape from there, you've effectively got your players sort of locked into this gigantic dungeon that they have no choice but to move forward, whichever way forward may be, right? And I think that could lead to some interesting situations that your players could find themselves in or get themselves into. And due to the fact that it's a mega dungeon, you can incorporate entirely different ecosystems. You can incorporate entirely different biomes if you wanted to, you know, like you could incorporate all sorts of different kinds of monsters and creatures if you wanted to. Perhaps there's a level of the dungeon, once they get low enough, that's sort of semi-submerged because it hits the water table beneath the planet, right? Or at the base of the planet, rather. And the players now have to fight all sorts of aquatic type creatures, right? And you can throw in different kinds of monsters that way, right? Perhaps there's a spot where the tunnels of this section of this dungeon have collapsed and it's all sort of like roots and dirt and stuff. And you can incorporate all sorts of like bugs and slugs and all sorts of nasties for your players to go up against as they make their way towards the final section or final area of this campaign. And throughout all of this, you could create things sort of like merchants or shopkeepers in a way where perhaps there is a chamber or something that has a strange sort of Terran reality in which a merchant can present themselves or come through the wormhole and offer up trade or goods and services to the players, and they can buy and sell stuff, they can trade stuff, they can barter with them. And you could have it be one of those things where the merchant, for whatever reason, is given a pass to traverse between these dimensions or realities to enter and exit. But when the players try to, they can't because they're forbidden from escaping. And that in and of itself could lead to its own curiosities, right? Like, why does this merchant have the ability to leave and to come and go as they please when everything else seems to be trapped in here, ourselves included? And then eventually, once the players get to the final chamber, they take on the Demilich, which will be a tough fight either way. And they either succeed and earn the renown and the treasure and the legend and legacy of their success in taking on such a volatile and powerful monster, or they become food for its phylactery, right? Another way that you could use a Demilich would be if you didn't want to make them the last boss and say you already have a group of players that is already at high level type thing and you'd like to just make an encounter using a Demilich, then what you can do is you can present the Demilich as an encounter that the players walk into sort of in action. So as an example, let's say the players are traveling to this city or town, and let's say this town has a temple of some sort to worship one or many or all of the gods. And this temple was built within the last 200-300 years, perhaps. However, by digging into the history of this town, they realized that this temple was built atop the remains and foundations of a much older temple that fell into ruins for whatever reason. Perhaps this town was the starting town that your players began their campaign and their quests on, and they grew fond of the captain of the guard, let's say. Well, as your players are traveling and on their adventures, they get word from this town that the captain of the guard went to investigate something that was happening beneath the temple because perhaps there was a sinkhole and an opening revealed itself. Perhaps there was a collapse of the temple structure on the surface, revealing some means of entry into the older ruins. Perhaps the town has gone to war with another faction or another kingdom or something like that, and they've attacked the temple to destroy morale and remove any place of safety and refuge that the people of the town may have. And in doing so, they've opened up the passageway to this ancient temple beneath the surface. So the players presumably would go and make their way back to the town to see what's going on, and you could have the town now be overrun by undead creatures, monsters, or the army of the opposing kingdom, or both. But the upshot of that is that the commander or captain of the guard that they grew so fondly of and who gave them their first number of quests, their first handful of quests, has gone missing within the underground tomb. So the players have no choice but to venture down in there. And so they descend into the tomb, fighting all sorts of baddies, undead and alive, humanoid and monstrous, all sorts of stuff like that. And as they get to this final area, this final chamber, they see the captain of the guard there making their way towards perhaps an altar or something in the center of the room, in which there sits a skull encrusted in gemstones. And before they can act, or if they don't realize what's going on, if the characters don't know of Demiliches and how they behave, then the captain of the guard picks up the skull and their soul is drained into one of the gemstones. And then at that point, you can have the players fight the Demilich again in its lair, or perhaps not. Perhaps this Demilich found its place of rest here, but it's not necessarily its lair. Perhaps it was taken from its lair and placed here and then trapped away. And you could have the players combat the Demilich in this room and destroy it and see if they can find or figure out which gemstone it is that their friend got absorbed into. Or if you wanted to start this off, if you wanted to do this at a lower level, what you could do is have a scenario like this play out. However, once the Demilich absorbs the soul of the captain or commander or what have you of the guard or whomever it is, the Demilich has received enough power to sustain itself to escape. And so the Demilich just flees. And then that becomes sort of the kicking off point to the campaign for your players. And the players are constantly seeking information on where the Demilich is, the history of this Demilich, where did they live, where did they establish or construct their laboratory, where did they reside, where did they keep their stores, were they worshipped, did they have any followers, what was their specialty, what was their, all sorts of stuff that can help build out the campaign and build out the tone of the adventures that your players will be going on in order to save their best friend or in order to save one of their friends type thing. Finally, another way that you could use a Demilich is like that of a general or a kind of invisible hand, if you would, sort of the boss behind the boss of the campaign, which I believe I alluded to in our last episode where we covered the Death Knight. So just to give you guys kind of a brief overview, the campaign I suggested for your players would be the adventurers are effectively trying to defeat and destroy a guild of Death Knights, right? This sort of group of Death Knights. So imagine like King Arthur and his round table of knights, but they've been corrupted and become undead and stuff like that. And so the entirety of the campaign is to find and deal with and destroy, defeat, overcome this group of corrupted knights. And then once the players get to the end of the campaign and they're about to defeat the final Death Knight and save the day, it turns out that the Death Knights were serving a larger, evil, nefarious entity in the way of the Demilich. And you could have it set up in a cool way there where perhaps the skull is sort of encased in one of those treasure display boxes, like how people keep like an autographed signed baseball in a display case on a pedestal or something like that. And perhaps the destruction of the group of Death Knights empowers the Demilich and allows it to be released and reawakened and cause all sorts of trouble for the players. Perhaps that was the trade-off that the Knights made in order to convert themselves into Death Knights. Perhaps they all made a pact with the Demilich and effectively said, like, we'll change ourselves and convert ourselves into these undead monstrosities and be your servants for you to feed off of and gain power from and sustain yourself with. But in doing so, you remain docile in a sort of hibernative state, right? And by destroying the Death Knights, the Demilich has now been awoken because the pact has been broken. So I think that could make for a pretty cool campaign for your players as well. It could lead to some very interesting stuff. All in all, though, I think that the Demilich is actually a pretty cool monster, and I would definitely use it and definitely want to use it as sort of the main baddie for my campaign or for one of my campaigns. I would certainly use the Demilich because it presents a lot of sort of thematic flavor and allows for a lot of different options when brainstorming and mulling over how you would present it in the way of a campaign or as the final boss or even as an encounter, like just sort of a standalone encounter that may lead to more, right? It sort of throws a couple of hooks into the players, and presumably the players would be interested in a giant gemstone encrusted skull flying around. So I think that the Demilich makes for a pretty sweet villain and a pretty sweet final bad guy for a long and harrowing campaign. But that's all I got for you fine folks for today's episode of Monsters Manifested. Thank you all once again for tuning in. I highly appreciate it. Please feel free to leave a review, rate the podcast, let me know what you think, let me know what you'd like to hear more of, let me know what you'd like to hear less of, let me know if there's any types of episodes or shows or anything like that you'd like me to do. If you'd like me to cover something other than just monsters, I'd be more than happy to do that. And if you folks are watching this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, I'd ask that you like, share, and subscribe, comment, all of that fun stuff, as it would help me out a lot, help the channel out a lot, and it would be highly appreciated. Next week's episode, we'll be covering demons, and there's a number of demons to go through. So chances are I will present to you each demon in its own episode. If there are some lesser demons or smaller types of demons that I can sort of combine into one episode, I'll do that. But I think for the most part, especially for the demon lords, they'll all be getting their own episode. But once again, that's it for me. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good day, everyone.